Sure. So I got introduced to Dungeons and Dragons when my parents bought me the red basic set in '83 with the Elmore cover, Menser edition. I was also watching the cartoon when it was on airing at that time, and I played D&D and a whole bunch of other tabletop games. I liked a lot of the superhero games like Heroes Unlimited and Champions and Marvel, the Phase Rip edition, and then I got into Palladium games, Rifts. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, went into World of Darkness in the '90s, and near the end of third edition, early 2000s, I kind of stopped playing. Went to grad school, got married, had kids, and then in 2014, a friend invited me to play fifth edition on Roll20, and I was hooked once again, and so I've been playing it constantly ever since. Although I've expanded to include a lot of other games too. Uh, I became a kind of dungeon master. I got all of the people that I played with back in the '80s and '90s. I got the band back together, so to speak, and I DM'd them through a big campaign, levels 1 to 20. It was great. And eventually, I made friends in the larger gaming community, and some of them were creators themselves, and they invited me to participate and collaborate. And after I did that for a few years, I worked with Aaron Acevedo of Sigil Entertainment Group on some Savage Worlds content and some D&D. And I realized that this is something I wanted to do, with my spouse Amy a little more consistently. So we launched Arcanist Press in February of this year. Oh, and then when I'm not doing tabletop gaming, I am a college philosophy professor in Florida. Well, a couple things. One, I was, just to be clear, this didn't come out of nowhere or out of my head ex nihilo. I was reading articles by people. N.K. Jemison's got this great blog post on the unbearable baggage of orking. And then people like James Mendez Hodes, Graham Barber, Tristan Tarwater were writing on this problem of uh, kind of race in D&D, and I've been hearing people talk about this. And so they made me aware of this problem. And so I just thought last fall, for my own home games, I wondered whether I could come up with a solution. And my goal was just to come up with something that addressed the racial essentialism, which I'm happy to talk about after if you want. But in a way that still felt like D&D, because there are other systems out there that give you like, menus of traits, and you can buy them with points, and it feels like you're playing GURPS or something. No, not to knock GURPS, but it's a point buy sort of character creation system. Right. It just doesn't feel to me like what I loved about fifth edition was fifth edition harkened back for me to basic D&D and to kind of earlier editions that were a little more, especially the basic stuff, pick up and play, a little more intuitive. And so I wanted to retain that, and so this was the solution. And I just put it out there, thinking in February at this 2 week zine quest, I put a goal of $300 so I could buy a piece of cover art. And then yeah, I some people online got wind of it and started retweeting it, and then it got a larger audience and kept growing. And so it grew enough after about a week that I realized, oh, I've made enough money now where I can buy more art and even hire like an editor to make it look nice. So I hired Hannah Rose, who does. She's a freelancer for Wizards of the Coast. She did the editing on like the Wildmount book, and she's worked on several of their other official books. And so having her on board and then her, tweeting about it as well, kind of got it to a much larger audience. And so it got up to like 917 backers, $7,500 if there's a $300 goal. So yeah, quite a bit exceeded the goal. And honestly, it's just been growing since. That we went into hibernation for a few months just preparing it. And then when we released it in June, it really did just explode again. And so it's selling really, really well on drive through and getting more attention. So that's been delightful. So sure. So, racial or biological essentialism is the view that certain traits, characteristics, features of human beings, including things like behaviors and attitudes, are uh, biological, but more precisely, with the concept of racial essentialism, not just a result of their individual genetics. It's not just who your parents are, it's that you're a part of a larger ethnic or racial group. And so it's not just describing, oh, you are smart or fast or violent because of who you yourself are, but it's because you're a member of this racial group. And so that's where the problem comes in the real world is for two things. First of all, it's just in general scientifically incorrect, right? I mean, it's quite an open question to determine how much your individual genetics might or might not contribute to your behavior as an adult. But one thing that is clear is there's not some sort of race category in your genes that can be kind of clearly defined. Individual genetics are real, but racial genetics aren't really. They're much there isn't a clear cutout for like black people's genetics versus white people's genetics. And so ascribing a property like intelligence to a national or racial genetic source is just bad science and wrong. But the second problem there is that it used to be what science thought maybe 200 years ago, 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. But for the most part, in the past 100 years, it's been debunked. And the only people that hang on to it are usually people that use it to justify racism. Yeah, so they use it as a basis for their racist ideologies that, well, like white people are superior, or this category is by nature violent, and that category is by nature weak, or whatever. That's it's so it's in the real world, it's not only bad science and false, it's also harmful and racist. Now, then the question is, well, hey, elves, dwarves, these aren't real. This isn't the real world. What's the problem, you might ask? And I would respond in the following way. I'd say, look, here's the thing: racism and racial essentialism harm people in the real world. And if you are a target of it, you know what it feels like to be harmed in that way. So when you're sitting down to play a game and all of a sudden you have to deal with that again, there it is in your face. You're trying to create a character and they're talking to you in the same way that racists talk about you in the real world. And when they harm you, it can be off-putting. It can alienate those people. They say, "Oh man, I don't really want to put up with, all elves are this way and all half orcs. I wanted to play a half orc, but then I read how they're being described like racists describe me in the real world." Now, that doesn't mean that half orcs just are stand-ins for Asians or blacks or something, but it sure does make often, and I'm just basing this on their reports, members of marginalized groups, it reminds them of this hatred they have to deal with in the real world. And so it ruins the fun for them. So, I mean, and I for those people who still don't buy it, I would say, look, it's a form of violence that some people don't want to encounter in their games. Imagine if you had to sit down and play a D&D game and you had to, in order to create your character, you had to encounter another form or other forms of unpleasant violence from the real world, like sexual violence or class violence or religious violence. Imagine if, in order to make your character, you had to describe the ways in which these things affected you, your character. You might say, gosh, this isn't very fun. I think it's weirdly inappropriate that this is an opt-out situation. Because another answer people give is, if you don't like it, change it at your table. You D&D, you can do whatever you want, which is true, but the default rules include all of this. And I would sure prefer if the default rules didn't. And then if you wanted to talk in this sort of way, you could at your table. But the new player coming to D&D for the first time, encountering this, is like, oh, I don't really want to do that. There are other games that don't force me to do this. And so these sets of rules are trying to address that uh, in a way that still feels like D&D, though. No, that's exactly right. I mean, if I can just jump in there real quick, because I think that I just want to make a note about this, because this is I almost I sat down to try to solve this problem and I ended up accidentally creating, and then once I realized I was creating this, I ran with it. It's super useful as a tool for creating more interesting characters and building more realistic worlds. I mean, let's face it, if elves and orcs, or elves and dwarves, or halflings and tieflings, or whoever lived in the same city for generations, things are going to happen, right? And it's you're going to have exchange of culture. You're going to have ancestral combinations. And again, you want to, I mean, even if you look at the classic Lord of the Rings sources, Aragorn was a human raised by elves, and that made him fundamentally different than other humans. Right. So exactly. So that the rules will actually allow for mechanics to do that. It's nice. Everyone could always have told a story like that, but these are mechanics that actually, so that the traits of the races, help tell that story. Yeah, totally. I mean, and why, and not just that, but like, so yeah, why not an orc and an elf? If an orc can have a baby with a human and an elf can have a baby with a human, why can't an orc and an elf have a baby? Or what about halflings and gnomes, right? Why can't you have, yeah, I mean, that could totally happen, right? If an elf and a human can, then why not a halfling and a gnome? But there are some cases in older editions, like Dark Sun setting has half dwarves. So there are, some other places where the story gets told, but not in fifth edition. Right. I mean, this was more of an interesting design challenge. So there's actually quite a few solutions out there that, like, there's a book, there's a couple on DM's Guild, Grazilak's Guide to Ancestry, Half Race Handbook. There's a new one that just came out called An Elf and an Orc Had a Little Baby. Right? And they each provide, and they're all interesting solutions, and they each have different ways of solving this problem. I wanted to go for the simplest possible, which is you look at the entry for the orc ancestry, you look at the entry for the human ancestry. Each of them have a couple traits. Pick one from each. That's it. That's the offspring. So you can choose, like, well, do you want the elven fey ancestry or do you want the orc? Like, you choose which of the traits you want to have, and that would allow for half a dozen different permutations. It does allow, now I'll admit, it does allow for some min-maxer to try to choose what they think is the most powerful trait from each. But I happen to think, and I might, not everyone agrees with me, but I don't think most of the what are called racial traits are actually particularly unbalancing. I think that Wizards of the Coast did a pretty good job designing the races such that, elves, orcs, dwarves, humans, gnomes, halflings, they all have, none of their traits are unbalancing by themselves. And even when you put them together in different ways. Now, there's a couple exceptions, like the Wantee's magic resistance and poison immunity is a little too powerful, maybe. And maybe you think the Aarakocra's, like, just kind of unlimited flight is a little too powerful. But I actually, in our versions of this book, so that with the second expansion we released some expansions that have bird folk and snake people and all this sort of thing. Um, we actually kind of toned that down to try and address balance concerns. But yeah, you're always going to have, it's possible to generate two or three or four different permutations of, like I said, elf and orc, and some will be more powerful than others. But I think they'll all fall within the range of what Wizards of the Coast deems like playable. All right. So that's the goal, at least. Yeah, we definitely let I mean, my policy as a designer for fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons is to trust the designers. People like Jeremy Crawford and they did a great job designing this game and all the extensive play testing. And one of the things I really like as a principle of fifth edition is narrative first. And I mean, fourth edition has its great strengths, but it was much more of a mechanics sort of focused system. Whereas when you look at the way spells or traits or features are described in fifth edition, it's quite story oriented first. And so I think that if you take that sort of attitude towards what we're doing with these ancestries and cultures, it makes perfect sense because there's a total narrative reason for the system. It's like, well, why is it that you built the system with these traits? It's not perfectly mathematically balanced. It might not be perfectly mathematically balanced, but I think it's perfectly narratively balanced. So feedback, yeah. So it's been overwhelmingly positive. Now there have been a few outspoken, angry trolls. I got accused of being the worst thing to happen to D&D since TSR sold D&D to Wizards of the Coast the other day, which is a bit bombastically hyperbolic. Fine, whatever. I think that anytime, what almost always happens is somebody on social media or on some YouTube video says something negative about a product, then some of their followers just go and dogpile on that product for a little while, or they'll see. We had an article that featured us in Polygon, which is a very large video game website, which with a readership that extends far beyond the kind of normal channels that I would get involved in. And so we had some people coming in that were with all kinds of hostile things to say, but almost every single one made it quite clear they actually hadn't read past the headline, right? So it's very easy to just dismiss, you know, or the number one response is probably like, well, if you just call it species, the problem goes away. But of course, Well, the short answer is it doesn't do away with the essentialism, right? It's just species essentialism instead of race essentialism. It still is treating people as though you can categorize their personality and intelligence and ability based on like the part of the world they're from. Call it species, call it race, call it ethnic group. It's still essentialism, and that's the problem. Um, so, but I say that in the intro to the book, right? Or I addressed, talk about that, and I've talked about it online. And but the people that sometimes get angry clearly didn't do their reading. They didn't do their homework. I'm a college professor, and so they get a poor score on their quiz. But there's been a few people like that, but no, the sales and the personal, like the response. But what matters for me most is the people that I respect have had nice things to say about it. People that I know and respect their judgment. Other designers, players, GMs. So that's made it worth it. I mean, I don't know if you saw, we just announced today, like a couple hours ago, that I actually haven't. Ooh, that's right. I haven't posted on the Discord yet. I tweeted this a couple hours ago that we're going to be having it translated into Portuguese, and we're working with an educational collective in Brazil who will be using the Portuguese translation to teach D&D and to use it to talk about race and racism to poor kids in the favelas. So it's like, you know what? I can tolerate a few angry racists yelling at me on Facebook to know that that's type of thing is going to happen. So yeah, yeah. So there has been. I apologize. I kind of misunderstood. So two things that come up. One is one that I'm trying to address, but I might not ever fully be able to, which is some people say, and I understand this, and I think it's reasonable. They say, look what we've done. So we'll take like elven ancestry, and then we separate out the learned or taught traits from the player's handbook and call them elven culture. And so some people point out, hey, you're just trading racial essentialism for cultural essentialism, right? Which is legitimate. I mean, because you elven. So we try and solve that in a couple ways. First, by the time if you look at, because we actually have two expansions, custom ancestries and cultures and more ancestries and cultures. Together, they have about 126 mixtures of ancestry and culture. Okay, so, there's like 6 or 7 different elven cultures described in across all of these books. So that's one way we were trying to address that. But there's still a lot of the ethnicity, or I'm sorry, the ancestries that we don't have multiple cultures for. And that's legitimate. I understand that. One reason we did that is because we were trying to make it still feel plug and play, so to speak, with D&D, and that's the way D&D does it. Um, Another thing people were sometimes asking for is they would ask, well, I'd like to see elven mountain culture and elven coastal culture and elven urban culture, or just take the elven out of it, urban, coastal, mountain, arctic, this valley and the Great Plains, as though, those sorts of cultures, write those. And so in the book More Ancestries and Cultures, we have a section at the end that is geographic cultures, like it's all the officially recognized geographies in the D&D system. So, there's like 11 of them: mountain and underdark and coastal and hills and all that stuff. So that's one way to deal with that kind of thing that people have been asking for. But still, people sometimes want more info. Like they'll say, well, you describe bird folk and you only give a couple paragraphs talking about them. I would like to know, like, where do they live? What are their leaders like? What religions do they follow? They want me to build a world, a setting, right? Which is great. And I love, love, love settings, but it's not my strength, right? I much feel I'm much more like a DJ than a composer or a remixer than a novelist. Like, I'm not going to be the one to share my grand vision of the world. I'm the one who's like, here are some tools. Now you show me your grand vision of the world with these, right? I'd rather facilitate somebody else's fun than dictate it in that way. Although I love it when people do that for me, and I love watching it happen. I'm very, frankly, a little envious of people that can sit down and write a world. But even when I DM, I'm very much of a rip-off artist. I take stuff from other people and use that. No, no, the new books don't do a lot of world building either. They speak in general terms. So they'll say something like, bird folk, cultures are. And so I tried very hard in writing those later books, the 2 later books, which are much more substantive. Just to be clear for anyone watching this who doesn't know, the core book only has what's called the content that's legally allowed under the open gaming license. So that's only the 8 races in the player's handbook and one sub race per. So it's only like high elf and hill dwarf and lightfoot halfling. It's only 8. So and there's literally 0 words of lore. It's only the mechanics. It's and this is so because otherwise, if you want to kickstart and publish on drive-through, you have to limit yourself to what's in what's called the system reference document, and it's very limiting. So the Kickstarter project and the original book, Ancestry and Culture, an alternative race in 5e, only has that stuff in it. So there's very little world building at all. The later books, I created a bunch of those races where what I would do is I would look at classic ones like Minotaur, or and then look at make versions of, well, okay, I don't have Drow because that's intellectual property of wizards, but I do have deep elves, right? That sort of thing. And so I would write a couple paragraphs describing, but I tried to give them some like a hook, like an adventure hook or a story hook for a DM without like using proper nouns. So like the bird folk were like generally they live in areas or villages or communities perched on the top edge, like on the edge of a cliff and this sort of thing. So, but I also tried very hard to make sure that when I talked about cultures and communities, I talked about it in a way that made it possible that actually there's not very many of that ancestry there. Like, so a bird folk culture might actually just be that it's inspired by kind of traditional bird folk ways, and there's mostly be not bird folk there, or they might be only one group among many. It just so happens that some of the practices there are ones that kind of bird folk propagated more than others. And so like language in every single one of those entries is things like members of bird folk communities often shared the following traits. And when we would talk about them, we'd use all these qualifiers like some communities do this and other communities are like that. So I tried hard to avoid a lot of the worst of the kind of cultural essentialism, and in so doing, built the framework of a world, but I didn't fill any in. Now, would I in the future? I think the next thing we'll do that would be closer to that is um, we're now going to start putting out stuff on. We got approval to put ancestry and culture related content on DM's Guild, which allows us to use the official Wizards of the Coast intellectual property. So we can do cultures of the Forgotten Realms or cultures of Ravenloft or something. And that will allow us to help ourselves to a lot more kind of meat, you know? Yeah, I mean, so I'm thinking of the books we've put out so far are tools for people to homebrew, right? Or to you can use they're general enough that they're compatible with the official Wizards of the Coast stuff. So if you want to play in a game of Descent into Avernus, the most recent published book, you could just take one of the ancestries and cultures out of ours, and you'll say, well, they talk generally about living in a city or living in an Arctic environment. I'm going to say I'm from Icewind Dale or Waterdeep, So people are perfectly able to do that. In the future books, though, we might be more specific. Like a Ravenloft book might be Dusk Elf ancestry, Vistani culture. Like it's specific to fun things in the world, right? So not right now, no. We have those two, or there's two short ones, or kind of two parts of one longer one, I guess. In the core book, it was a stretch goal, right, that I had described, and it definitely is an attempt to demonstrate the values and the kind of examples of the rules. But I also wrote them in a very family-friendly way, just because I have kids and that's what I was running. So if people are looking for a family-friendly game to run with kids, I would recommend it. If you prefer your D&D, a little darker and edgier, you might have to do a little, adjusting. But yeah, it's in there. So I did want to say two things though, since you'd asked about that a moment ago. Do you mind? Is that okay? So two things. One, just very briefly, there's a YouTube channel called Let's Roll Characters that has been using the ancestry and culture rules, and every episode is just 20 or 30 minutes, and they roll up a character entirely randomly, and they just like they roll a d10 for ancestry, and then they roll a d10 for culture, just using the core book, and then they make the character based on what the roles are. They roll stats and everything, and it's actually one of the things they've said is it's remarkable how much story you get out of just that ancestry culture duo, because you're like, well, why would a dragonborn be raised by dwarves? You know? And suddenly you're like, right? So that's a really cool example of how that can tell. One of the things I love the most about mechanics in a role playing game is the way that a rule can make a story, right? And that's, I mean, I think any good rule in a role playing game is build story. So I think that's what I was going for with this. And I think I got lucky and made one that worked. But I do want to say one final thing, which is I'm honored and delighted that people are like the book and that they're buying our products. But I do have to acknowledge, and it did come out quite by accident at a time when all of a sudden a lot more of attention is being drawn to, the Black Lives Matter movement and also movements, people worrying about racism and calling it out in Dungeons and Dragons. So that was just a coincidence. I had written this thing last year. Right, right. But it kind of really got a lot of mainstream attention, and that might have helped my sales. But I would call on anybody who likes the book and likes what we're doing to go look at what I think would really help the community in role playing games and Dungeons and Dragons is buying the products of Black and Indigenous and marginalized creators. Because I happen to be white, and though I want people to use this product, I'd also like them to spend their money on, you know, something by Orion Black or something by, Gabe James or any number of people. That I think, and if Wizards of the Coast hires and listens to some designers and administrators of color, that's probably the best thing that could happen for this industry. So that's the thing I'd want to definitely include is that call.